Let's dive into the story behind one of the most famous vehicles in the entire world. I mean, its name is literally a household word for anything rugged and adventurous. We're talking, of course, about the World War II Jeep and how a desperate need from the military led to an absolute American icon.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, he called it one of the 6 most vital U.S. vehicles to win the war. I mean, think about that for a second. Out of all the incredible tanks and planes and ships, this humble little truck was right up there. That tells you just how critical this thing was.
So why? What made this little vehicle so essential? Well, the whole story of the Jeep really kicks off with a massive problem the U.S. Army was facing right before the Second World War. Yeah, this really lays it all out. Before World War II, the Army's motor pool had this huge gap. On one side, you had motorcycles. Sure, they were fast on a paved road, but they were pretty much useless in the mud, and you couldn't carry anything on them. On the other side, you had these big, heavy four-wheel drive trucks. They were powerful, for sure, but way too big and clunky for scouting missions. What they needed, what they were desperate for, was something right in the middle. A vehicle that was light, tough, and could go absolutely anywhere. So this critical need, it kicked off one of the most intense and honestly controversial design competitions in the history of cars. And the prize? A massive government contract that would literally shape the future of how armies move. So in June of 1940, with war just exploding across Europe, the Army puts out this challenge with a list of demands that seemed, well, impossible. A four-wheel drive system was a must, but the real killer was the weight limit, no more than 1,300 pounds. Most engineers at the time thought that was just crazy, that it couldn't be done. And to make it all worse, the deadline to deliver a working prototype was just 49 days. Yeah, 49. As you can imagine, most of the big car companies just said, no thanks. But one company didn't back down, and it wasn't a giant like Ford or GM. Nope, it was the American Bantam Car Company, this tiny, almost bankrupt firm out of Pennsylvania. And against all the odds, they did it. They met the crazy deadline and delivered a prototype that became the blueprint for the Jeep. It was a total underdog story. But this is where the story gets complicated. And it brings up a question that people have been arguing about for decades. If Bantam designed it, why do we always associate the Jeep with other companies? Well, the Army got nervous. They were afraid that Bantam, this tiny little company, was just too small to build the massive numbers of vehicles they were going to need. So they did something pretty controversial. They shared Bantam's blueprints with their much bigger competitors, Willys Overland and Ford. The arguments after the war got so intense that the government actually had to step in. And in 1948, the Federal Trade Commission set the record straight. They ruled that Willys was, and I'm quoting directly here, unfairly taking credit for the creation. The verdict couldn't have been clearer. The idea, the concept, it all started with American Bantam. And this chart, man, it just shows you the brutal reality of wartime manufacturing. Even though they had the winning idea, Bantam just didn't have the factory space. So you had Willys and Ford with all their industrial muscle pumping out the vast majority of Jeeps. And the final, painful twist of irony? Bantam, the company that invented it, was pretty much stuck building trailers for the very vehicle they created.
Okay, so let's get into the vehicle itself. The final, standardized design was known as the Willys MB and the Ford GPW. They were pretty much identical machines, built by 2 different companies. So what made them so special? Well, to find out, we're going to go straight to the source, the Army's own technical manual, printed in 1944.
Looking at the official specs is like looking at the vehicle's DNA. The final weight was over 2,400 pounds, way more than that original 1,300-pound Dream. But that extra weight was needed to make it tough enough. A top speed of 65 miles per hour was actually really impressive for the time. And that super simple 6-volt electrical system, that was key to keeping things reliable out in the field. These are the raw numbers behind a legend.
And digging through the manual shows you just how incredibly purpose-built this thing was. Take the blackout lights. Super important for moving at night without being seen. It wasn't just one simple switch. No way. First, you had to pull the main knob out to a specific spot, which physically locked it so you couldn't accidentally turn on your bright headlights. Only after you did that could you pull a totally separate knob to turn on the tiny little blackout lamp. That's not just a detail, that's smart battlefield-focused design.
But a Jeep was so much more than just a collection of parts and switches. For the soldiers who relied on it every single day, this vehicle had to be tough, it had to be versatile, and most of all, it had to be reliable. It truly had to be a soldier's best friend.
And again, the manual does not sugarcoat things. This warning right here about operating in the cold is, well, it's stark. If you were careless and let your battery die, it would freeze solid and literally break apart at just 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine being a soldier in the Battle of the Bulge. A detail like that wasn't just some inconvenience. It was a life-or-death situation.
Its versatility was just legendary. With special kits, it could drive through deep water right off a landing craft. It acted as a command car, an ambulance, a machine gun platform. You could haul anti-tank guns into position. And if you folded the windshield down, its entire profile was just 52 inches high, making it an incredibly small target. They could even pack the whole thing into a crate and assemble it on some distant battlefield. It just did everything. So when the war finally ended, there were hundreds of thousands of Jeeps scattered all over the world. But this story was far from over. The Jeep wasn't about to become a relic, it was about to start its second act.
First off, just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale here. Between Willys and Ford, more than 640,000 of these things rolled off the assembly lines during the war. They were absolutely everywhere, a constant rumbling symbol of Allied mobility and industrial might.
And this timeline shows you exactly how that wartime workhorse became the icon that we all know today. It starts in 1941 with the standardized military model. But the real game changer came in 1945, when Willys introduced the CJ2A, the civilian Jeep. This was a huge deal. It was the first mass-produced four-wheel drive vehicle you could just go out and buy, and it basically created the entire market for off-road vehicles. The design kept serving in the military through Korea and beyond. And that same unmistakable DNA, the 7-slot grille, the round headlights, that tough stance, you can still see it in the Jeeps on the road right now.
The thing is, the Jeep was never just a car. It was a tool. It was a solution to a really complex problem, and it valued simplicity, toughness, and pure usefulness above everything else. It changed how armies moved, and then it changed how all of us thought about cars. Which kind of leaves us with a final question to chew on. What modern innovation really embodies that same spirit? What today is as simple, as rugged, and as revolutionary as that original Jeep was back then? Something to think about.